"I love you, Mom." Those were the last words he always said before leaving the house. Not once in a while. Not when something special was happening. Not when he thought something might go wrong. Every single time. A 13-year-old boy, stepping out into a quiet Pennsylvania afternoon, would always pause at the door, look back at his mother, and say those words like it was a promise he intended to keep. "I love you, Mom. I'll be back." And she always believed him. Because he always came back. Until one summer day in 1985, everything felt the same. The weather was calm. The town was quiet. Nothing seemed out of place. He said it again. "I love you, Mom." He smiled. He got on his bicycle. And he rode away like he had done 100 times before. But this time, he never came home. No warning. No goodbye. No explanation. Just silence. And a mother standing at the door, waiting for a child who would never return. Somewhere in that ordinary afternoon, something went terribly wrong. And for decades, the question would haunt an entire town. What really happened to the boy who always said he would come back? Welcome to Cold Case 247, where we uncover the truth behind real cold cases that continue to haunt families and communities long after the headlines disappear. Before we begin, if you enjoy carefully researched true crime documentaries, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and hit the subscribe button. The story you're about to hear is the real-life case of David Wellington Reed, a boy whose disappearance shocked an entire community and whose family spent decades searching for answers. David Wellington Reed was born on January 17, 1972, in Pennsylvania. From the very beginning, life dealt him challenges that no child should have to face. Before he was old enough to understand what death meant, tragedy entered his family. When David was only about 17 months old, his father was killed in a car accident. He would grow up with no memories of his father, relying only on photographs, stories, and the recollections of relatives to imagine the man he had lost before he ever had the chance to know him. The absence of a father shaped the Reed family in ways that would last for years. His mother, Joan Reed, suddenly found herself carrying responsibilities that had once been shared. Raising children while grieving the loss of a husband was never going to be easy, and although she did everything she could, the emotional burden was overwhelming. Those who knew Joan described her as a mother who deeply loved her children. But they also knew she struggled with the pain that had entered her life. Grief has a way of changing people, especially when it arrives without warning. As the years passed, Joan increasingly turned to alcohol while trying to cope with the losses she had suffered. Despite those hardships, David grew into a friendly, energetic young boy who loved spending time outdoors. People around the neighborhood recognized him not because of his last name, but because of his personality. He smiled often, greeted neighbors politely, and seemed happiest when riding his bicycle through the streets of Schuylkill Haven. Schuylkill Haven was the kind of town where children spent hours outside without constant supervision. Parents expected them home by dinner. Neighbors looked out for one another. Front doors were often left unlocked. It was a place where people believed they knew everyone. That sense of security would later become one of the most tragic misconceptions in the town's history. David attended school like every other child in the community, but his school years were far from perfect. He struggled with bullying. Some classmates mocked his appearance. Others teased him because he was heavier than many boys his age. His thick eyeglasses became another reason for cruel nicknames. Children can sometimes be brutally honest without understanding the damage their words can cause. For David, those comments hurt deeply. There were days when he avoided school because he simply didn't want to face another round of ridicule. It wasn't that he disliked learning. He disliked feeling unwanted. Still, there were teachers who recognized something special in him. One of them noticed David's fascination with airplanes. Like many young boys, he dreamed about flying. He imagined becoming a pilot one day, soaring high above the mountains and valleys of Pennsylvania, leaving the problems of everyday life far below him. To an adult, it may have sounded like the ordinary dream of an imaginative child. To David, it was hope. Outside the classroom, he found another source of pride. David had a newspaper route delivering copies of the Pottsville Republican. Every morning and afternoon, he rode through town making deliveries. It wasn't simply a way to earn spending money. It gave him responsibility. It gave him independence. People along his route grew accustomed to seeing him pedal past on his bicycle with newspapers tucked securely beside him. Many remembered that he almost always smiled or waved. For a young teenager trying to find confidence, those small interactions mattered. But during the summer of 1985, something happened that made David especially vulnerable without anyone fully realizing the danger. While swimming with friends at Lake Winona, David lost his eyeglasses. For most people, losing a pair of glasses is frustrating. For David, it was life-changing. Without them, his eyesight was extremely poor. Faces became blurred. Street signs were difficult to read. Recognizing people from even a short distance became nearly impossible. His mother intended to replace them as soon as she could, but money was tight. The Reed family had lived through years of financial hardship. Buying new glasses would have to wait. So David continued his daily routine nearly blind. He never complained much about it. Like many children, he adapted as best he could. But the reality was frightening. If someone called his name from across the street, he might not recognize who they were. If someone he thought he knew approached him, he might mistake them for a trusted friend. It was a vulnerability that could have placed him in tremendous danger. Around this same time, another devastating loss struck the Reed family. David's older brother, Ronald, died unexpectedly after suffering what was believed to have been a diabetic attack. Once again, Joan Reed buried someone she loved. Losing her husband had already changed her forever. Now she was burying one of her children. Family members later recalled how deeply this tragedy affected everyone in the household. The home became quieter. The sadness grew heavier. Yet through everything, David remained close to his mother. Despite the independence he enjoyed, there was one simple routine he almost never forgot. Every time he left the house, he would tell Joan the same 4 words. "I love you, Mom." It didn't matter whether he was heading to work, visiting friends, or riding around town. He always said it. Perhaps it had become a habit. Perhaps he simply wanted his mother to know she was loved. Whatever the reason, those words became part of their daily lives. No one imagined they would one day become their final goodbye. David also shared a special bond with his older brother Joe. Although there was a significant age difference between them, they connected through a shared interest. His bicycle. Joe often helped David repair and improve his prized 10-speed bike. They spent afternoons replacing parts, adjusting the seat, and making sure everything worked properly. Those moments meant more than simple repairs. They gave the brothers time together. For David, that bicycle represented freedom. It carried him to work. It carried him to friends' houses. It carried him through nearly every corner of Schuylkill Haven. People who knew David all agreed on one thing. He never abandoned that bicycle willingly. If he was somewhere, his bike was usually with him. That detail would later become one of the most haunting clues in the investigation. As August drew closer to its final weeks, life in Schuylkill Haven continued as normal. Families enjoyed the last days of summer. Children squeezed in every possible adventure before school resumed. The streets echoed with laughter. No one suspected they were only days away from witnessing one of the town's greatest tragedies. On the afternoon of August 21, 1985, David prepared to leave home once again. He carried only a small amount of money. He still didn't have his replacement glasses. As he headed toward the door, he turned to his mother one last time. "I love you, Mom." Joan smiled, expecting him home later that evening, just as she always did. She watched him climb onto his bicycle and disappear down the street. It was an ordinary goodbye. One that neither of them believed would be their last. The afternoon was warm, calm, and unremarkable. The sky over Schuylkill Haven was clear, and there was nothing to suggest that the ordinary rhythm of the day was about to be shattered. Children were outside enjoying the last weeks of summer vacation. Neighbors tended to their yards. Cars rolled slowly through the quiet streets. It was the kind of day that blended into every other summer afternoon. David pedaled away from home with the confidence of someone who knew every corner of his town. He had traveled these roads countless times before. Whether he was delivering newspapers, meeting friends, or simply riding for fun, the streets of Schuylkill Haven were familiar territory. Even without his glasses, he believed he was safe because almost everyone he encountered was someone he recognized. Or at least, someone he thought he recognized. That missing pair of glasses would later become one of the most heartbreaking details in the investigation. Without them, David's world was little more than blurred outlines and indistinct faces. If someone waved him over from a distance, he might assume it was a neighbor. If someone offered him a ride or asked for help, he may never have realized he was speaking to the wrong person. Investigators would later wonder whether that single circumstance made him far more vulnerable than anyone had realized. As the afternoon passed, David was seen by several people around town. Some remembered spotting him riding his bicycle. Others recalled seeing him near places where local teenagers often gathered. At the time, none of those sightings seemed important. After all, seeing David riding around Schuylkill Haven was an everyday occurrence. No one paid special attention. No one imagined they were among the last people who would ever see him alive. Back at home, Joan Reed continued with her day. Like many parents of that era, she wasn't constantly checking the clock every few minutes. Children in the mid-1980s enjoyed a level of independence that would seem unusual today. As long as they returned home before dinner, there was rarely any cause for concern. David understood that routine. No matter where he spent the afternoon, he almost always came home for dinner. It wasn't a strict household rule. It was simply something he always did. As evening approached, Joan began preparing the evening meal. She expected to hear the familiar sound of David's bicycle outside. She expected the front door to open. She expected to hear his voice. Instead, there was silence. She glanced at the clock. Perhaps he had lost track of time. Perhaps he had stopped to visit a friend. There were plenty of innocent explanations. She waited a little longer. Dinner was ready. His chair remained empty. The food she'd prepared for him began to grow cold. An uneasy feeling settled over her. Parents often describe an instinct they cannot explain. A quiet voice telling them that something isn't right. Joan felt it. This wasn't like David. He wasn't the kind of child who disappeared without telling someone where he was going. Especially not at dinner time. As the minutes turned into hours, worry became fear. She began calling friends and neighbors. Had anyone seen David? Was he spending the evening at someone's house? Had he mentioned changing his plans? One by one, the answers came back the same. No. No one knew where he was. The search began almost immediately. Family members spread out across Schuylkill Haven, checking every location David was known to visit. They searched the railroad tracks where local children often walked. They visited the stone wall known locally as the Bank Wall, a popular gathering place for teenagers. They rode through neighborhoods calling his name. They knocked on doors. They asked strangers if they had seen a young boy riding a 10-speed bicycle. Every passing hour increased the fear that something terrible had happened. Hospitals were contacted. There were no unidentified accident victims matching David's description. No admissions. No reports. Nothing. As darkness settled over the town, Joan realized she could no longer hope that David had simply stayed out too late. She contacted the police. Officers responded quickly. At first, they approached the situation the way many missing child cases were handled during that period. Children sometimes stayed with friends without informing their parents. Sometimes they ran away for a day or two. Sometimes they simply lost track of time. But as officers spoke with family members, it became clear that David's disappearance didn't fit those patterns. He had left with very little money. He hadn't packed clothes. He hadn't taken personal belongings. There was no indication that he planned to leave home. Most importantly, he had every reason to come back. Search teams were organized. Police officers, firefighters, volunteers, relatives, and neighbors joined together to comb the surrounding area. Fields were searched. Wooded areas were explored. Roads and trails were checked repeatedly. The hope was that David had become injured somewhere and was unable to return home. Everyone prayed they would find him alive. Morning arrived. The search continued. Then came a discovery that changed the entire investigation. Someone spotted a bicycle lying in tall weeds near the railroad tracks. As officers approached, they immediately recognized it. It belonged to David. The bicycle showed no obvious signs of damage. It hadn't been dismantled. It wasn't hidden carefully. It simply appeared abandoned. For investigators, that raised a disturbing question. Why would David leave behind the possession he valued so much? Family members were certain of one thing. He wouldn't. If his bicycle was sitting there alone, then something had interrupted whatever he had been doing. Police processed the bicycle as evidence. Unfortunately, the circumstances worked against them. The bike had remained outside overnight. Anyone could have touched it. Rain, humidity, and exposure had likely destroyed valuable forensic evidence. Fingerprint analysis produced nothing useful. No clear physical evidence explained what had happened. Investigators expanded their search. They interviewed more residents. Every possible witness was asked the same question. Had anyone seen David after that afternoon? Again, nothing. Days passed. Then, just when investigators feared the trail had gone cold, a woman contacted the police with information she claimed was extremely important. Her name was Kathy Shaw. She reported that on the day David disappeared, she had seen a light blue cargo van traveling slowly through town. According to her account, David was sitting inside the vehicle. She even claimed he waved to her through the passenger window. Most remarkably, she believed she had memorized the license plate number. For investigators desperate for a breakthrough, this sounded like the lead they had been waiting for. A vehicle. A possible suspect. A license plate. Detectives immediately attempted to trace the registration. To their surprise, the plate didn't exist. Not under that number. Not with any obvious variation. Again and again they checked. Again and again they reached the same conclusion. There was no matching vehicle. The promising lead began falling apart. As investigators looked more closely into Kathy Shaw's background, additional problems emerged. Her credibility had been questioned before. She had a history of substance abuse and previous legal troubles. Those familiar with her reputation expressed doubts about the reliability of her statement. Investigators faced a difficult dilemma. Was she honestly trying to help? Had she mistaken another child for David? Or was she intentionally misleading the investigation? There was no way to know. Without evidence supporting her claim, detectives reluctantly reached another dead end. The days turned into weeks. Searches became less frequent. Volunteers returned to work. Children prepared for school. Life slowly resumed across Schuylkill Haven. But for the Reed family, life had stopped. Every telephone call caused hope to rise. Every knock at the door brought fresh anticipation. Every rumor sparked another desperate search. Joan refused to give up. She believed her son was still alive. She had to believe it. As autumn gave way to winter, Christmas approached. For most families, it was a season of celebration. For the Reeds, it became another painful reminder of David's absence. Joan bought Christmas presents for her missing son. She wrapped them carefully and placed them beneath the tree. Some people questioned why. Others understood completely. As long as there was hope, there was a reason to keep his gifts waiting. She appeared on local television pleading for information. Her message was simple. If anyone knew anything, no matter how small, please come forward. Somewhere, she believed, someone had seen something. Someone knew the truth. But no answers came. Instead, only silence. 10 days after that emotional television appearance, everything changed. On a cold December afternoon, a man named Robert Howard made an unexpected call to police. He told dispatchers he had discovered what appeared to be human remains in the woods behind his property. When officers arrived at his home, they were stunned by what they saw. Sitting on the kitchen table was a human skull. Howard explained that he had found it while searching through nearby woods. Rather than leaving it where it was and immediately contacting authorities, he had carried it home. His actions immediately raised suspicions. Investigators questioned why anyone would remove possible evidence from a scene before notifying police. Was he simply panicking? Or was there another explanation? Howard cooperated fully with detectives. He agreed to show them exactly where he had found the remains. What they discovered next would devastate the Reed family. Investigators followed Robert Howard through a stretch of rugged woodland behind his property. The terrain was uneven, covered with thick brush, fallen branches, and patches of exposed rock. It wasn't the kind of place where people casually went for a walk. Even those who lived nearby had little reason to climb that hillside. Howard led the officers to the location where he said he had made the discovery. Within moments, it became painfully clear that the skull on his kitchen table had not been the only human remains scattered through the woods. Search teams carefully expanded the area. As they moved through the brush, more bones began to appear. Some were partially hidden beneath leaves. Others had been exposed by weather and wildlife. The remains were not found in a single location. They were scattered over a considerable distance, suggesting that animals had disturbed the site over the months since the body had been left there. Nearby, investigators discovered pieces of clothing. Although time and the elements had badly damaged the clothing, one detail immediately caught investigators' attention. Printed across the front of the t-shirt was the logo of the Pottsville Republican newspaper. The same newspaper David proudly delivered. The same shirt his family had watched him wear when he left home that August afternoon. For the searchers standing in those cold Pennsylvania woods, hope disappeared almost instantly. No one wanted to say the words aloud. But everyone feared they already knew whose remains they had found. The clothing was carefully collected. Every bone was documented before being removed. Investigators searched the surrounding area again and again, hoping to find additional evidence that might explain what had happened. There were no obvious weapons. No personal belongings that could immediately identify a suspect. No clear signs pointing to how David had died. Everything suggested that too much time had passed. Nature had done what nature always does. Rain. Snow. Animals. Changing seasons. Together, they had erased much of the evidence investigators desperately needed. The remains were transported for examination. Meanwhile, detectives contacted the Reed family. No parent is ever prepared for that phone call. For nearly 4 months, Joan Reed had lived between hope and fear. She had imagined David walking back through the front door. She had imagined receiving a call saying he had been found alive. Now she was being told that investigators believed they had discovered human remains that might belong to her son. Dental records would provide the answer. Within days, the results confirmed what everyone had feared. The remains were those of 13-year-old David Wellington Reed. The missing child who had vanished without a trace had been lying in those woods for months, only a short distance from homes where families had gone about their daily lives completely unaware. The town was devastated. People who had watched David grow up struggled to believe he had been so close the entire time. Parents held their children tighter. Neighbors asked themselves impossible questions. Had they walked past the area without realizing what was hidden there? Could they have found him sooner? Could anything have been done differently? Those questions would haunt Schuylkill Haven for decades. The next challenge facing investigators was determining how David had died. A forensic examination was performed by the county pathologist. Because so much time had passed, only skeletal remains were available for study. Soft tissue had long since disappeared. That severely limited what medical experts could determine. During the examination, one unusual feature immediately attracted attention. There appeared to be a small opening in David's breastbone. At first glance, investigators worried it might have been caused by a gunshot. If true, the case would immediately become a homicide investigation. Further examination, however, produced a different conclusion. The opening was not the result of violence. Instead, it was identified as a naturally occurring anatomical variation known as a sternal foramen. It was something David had been born with. It had nothing to do with his death. With that possibility eliminated, investigators found themselves facing an even greater problem. There were no broken bones clearly indicating a violent assault. There were no unmistakable injuries proving homicide. The remains simply did not provide enough evidence. Medical experts considered various possibilities. One theory involved diabetes. David's older brother had reportedly died after suffering complications believed to be related to the disease. Could David have experienced a similar medical emergency while alone? Was it possible he had collapsed in the woods and died without anyone finding him? The theory could not be confirmed. It also could not explain every question surrounding the case. Why had his bicycle been abandoned far from where his remains were discovered? Why had no one found him during the extensive searches conducted shortly after his disappearance? Why had witnesses reported suspicious behavior by certain individuals? None of it fit together neatly. Additional forensic specialists examined the remains using the best scientific methods available at the time. Unfortunately, they reached the same heartbreaking conclusion. There simply wasn't enough evidence to determine exactly how David died. The official cause of death would be listed as undetermined. It was a single word. But for David's family, it felt like an impossible sentence. Undetermined meant there was no officially recognized homicide. No murder weapon. No identified suspect. No prosecution. No justice. The investigation slowed dramatically. Without a confirmed cause of death, detectives had little legal foundation upon which to build a criminal case. The file remained open. But progress became increasingly difficult. David was laid to rest in Schuylkill Haven. Those who attended his funeral never forgot the sight that greeted them. Because only skeletal remains had been recovered, the coffin was remarkably small. Far smaller than anyone expected for a 13-year-old boy. Friends and relatives struggled to comprehend the reality before them. A child who had once raced through town on his bicycle. A boy who dreamed of flying airplanes. Now rested inside a coffin that reflected how little remained after months in the wilderness. The image stayed with many mourners for the rest of their lives. As the funeral ended, David's family hoped investigators would continue searching for answers. Instead, the years began to pass. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. then 15. Eventually, 2 decades had gone by. Children who had once played alongside David became adults with families of their own. New police officers joined the department. Old investigators retired. Businesses changed. Neighborhoods evolved. Yet the mystery surrounding David Reed remained exactly where it had begun. Unanswered. The emotional toll on the Reed family was devastating. Joan Reed never recovered from losing her youngest son. Friends described how grief consumed her. She struggled with alcoholism for years as she attempted to cope with losses that seemed impossible to overcome. First her husband. Then her oldest son. Now David. She carried those tragedies until her own death in the year 2000. She never learned what truly happened to her child. Other family members refused to let the case disappear. David's sister, Virginia, believed someone in Schuylkill Haven knew the truth. She could not accept that a 13-year-old boy had simply vanished and died without anyone knowing why. Month after month. Year after year. She contacted law enforcement. Sometimes she simply wanted reassurance that the case hadn't been forgotten. Sometimes she asked whether any new evidence had surfaced. Most of the time, the answer remained painfully familiar. Nothing new. No breakthroughs. No arrests. Many families eventually stop asking. Not because they stop caring. Because constant disappointment becomes unbearable. Virginia was different. She continued calling. She continued hoping. She continued believing. Unknown to her, the breakthrough she had waited for would eventually come from an investigator who refused to let old files gather dust. More than 20 years after David disappeared, a young homicide investigator with the Pennsylvania State Police asked a simple question that would change everything. Do you have any cold cases that still need another look? The answer waiting for him sat inside a thick case file bearing one name. David Wellington Reed. The moment that file landed on his desk, one of Pennsylvania's oldest mysteries quietly came back to life. And before long, long-buried secrets would begin surfacing from the silence. When the case file arrived on the desk of Pennsylvania State Police Corporal Robert Bettner, more than 2 decades had passed since David Reed disappeared. To many people, it was simply another cold case. Another file collecting dust in a cabinet. Another mystery that would probably never be solved. But Bettner refused to see it that way. He believed that time changes people. Memories fade, but guilt has a way of growing heavier. People who remain silent for years sometimes reach a point where they can no longer carry the burden alone. Relationships end. Friendships fall apart. Loyalties disappear. Someone who protected a secret in the 1980s might be willing to speak decades later. With that mindset, Bettner carried the entire case file home. He spread photographs, reports, witness statements, maps, and interview transcripts across his living room floor. He didn't rush. He read every page. Then he read them again. He studied the original investigation, looking not for mistakes, but for details that might have seemed insignificant at the time. The detectives who worked the case in 1985 had done everything they could with the evidence available. But technology had changed. People had changed. And perhaps most importantly, the town itself had changed. Bettner knew Schuylkill County well. He had grown up only a short distance away. Like many people from the area, he remembered hearing about David Reed when he was younger. It was one of those stories parents told their children. The kind of story that reminded everyone that terrible things could happen, even in a quiet town. Now he had an opportunity to uncover the truth behind that story. Before speaking with anyone else, Bettner contacted David's sister, Virginia Reed. For years, she had faithfully called investigators asking the same question. Was anyone still working on David's case? This time, the answer was different. Bettner told her he intended to reopen the investigation. For a moment, Virginia struggled to speak. She later explained that she never expected to hear those words again. After years of disappointment, someone was finally willing to start over. Not continue where the investigation had ended. Start over. Bettner made her a promise. He would follow every lead. He would re-interview every witness. He would examine every rumor. And he would not close the file until every possibility had been explored. Virginia agreed to help in any way she could. One of Bettner's first decisions surprised many people. Rather than quietly interviewing witnesses behind closed doors, he wanted the public involved. He believed someone in Schuylkill Haven had remained silent for far too long. Perhaps seeing David's face on television again would awaken memories people had buried. Perhaps guilt would finally outweigh fear. A television interview was arranged. Virginia appeared before cameras holding photographs of her younger brother. More than 20 years had passed, yet the pain in her voice remained unmistakable. She looked directly into the camera and made a heartfelt appeal. If anyone knew what had happened, if anyone had remained silent out of fear, now was the time to speak. She said she believed her brother had been murdered. And she believed someone in that community knew exactly who was responsible. The broadcast reached thousands of viewers across Pennsylvania. Within days, the phone began to ring. Tips started coming in. Some were vague. Others repeated rumors that had circulated for years. Many proved impossible to verify. But among those calls were witnesses who had never fully shared what they knew. One of those witnesses was a man named Andy Basinski. Back in the 1980s, investigators had questioned him. At the time, he provided very little information. Now, more than 20 years later, his attitude was completely different. He admitted he should have been more cooperative years earlier. People mature. Regret changes perspective. Basinski explained that there were things happening around Schuylkill Haven during the 1980s that many people preferred not to discuss openly. Drug use. Parties. People associating with dangerous individuals. The town had a darker side that wasn't visible to outsiders. During the conversation, Basinski mentioned a man investigators had never seriously considered. For privacy during portions of the investigation, that individual was publicly referred to as Fred. According to Basinski, Fred had associated with people involved in criminal activity during the mid-1980s. He reportedly drove a light blue van. That detail immediately caught Bettner's attention. For years, investigators had wondered about Kathy Shaw's report describing a light blue cargo van. Could this finally explain that mysterious lead? Bettner arranged to interview Fred. Before detectives even contacted him, something unexpected happened. Fred walked into the police station on unrelated business. Because of previous criminal convictions, he was legally required to update his address after moving. The timing couldn't have been stranger. Bettner took advantage of the opportunity. He asked Fred whether he would answer questions about David Reed. Fred agreed. Throughout the interview, he remained calm. He denied any involvement. Then he produced something investigators couldn't ignore. A documented prison record. Fred had been incarcerated during the period when David disappeared. Official records confirmed it. No matter how suspicious the circumstances appeared, he could not have committed the crime. Another promising lead disappeared. For many investigators, that might have been discouraging. Bettner viewed it differently. Eliminating suspects brought him one step closer to the truth. As additional interviews continued, another name surfaced repeatedly. Different witnesses. Different backgrounds. Different conversations. Yet the same individual kept appearing. Joseph Geiger. At first, the references were subtle. Someone remembered hearing him make an angry remark years earlier. Another recalled seeing him behaving strangely after David vanished. Individually, none of the statements proved anything. Together, they began forming a disturbing pattern. One witness described a party held sometime after David disappeared but before his remains were discovered. During the gathering, Joseph Geiger allegedly appeared deeply distressed. According to the witness, Geiger repeatedly muttered the same sentence. "I didn't mean to hurt him." At the time, those around him assumed he was intoxicated. No one connected the statement to David Reed. Years later, the memory took on an entirely different meaning. Another witness described an incident near the area known locally as the Bank Wall. David rode past on his bicycle. The witness claimed Geiger watched him and angrily complained that David had been disturbing marijuana plants he believed were growing nearby. According to that account, Geiger made a threatening remark about the young teenager. Again, the statement had never reached investigators during the original investigation. Perhaps witnesses were afraid. Perhaps they believed it wasn't important. Whatever the reason, the information remained hidden for decades. Then came another interview. A man named Christopher Major recalled a conversation that had troubled him for years. He remembered Geiger making a chilling comment while under the influence of drugs at a party. According to Major, Geiger claimed that if someone wanted to murder another person, Schuylkill County was the place to do it because they could get away with it. When Major asked who Geiger meant, the answer was simple: Reed. That single word caught Bettner's full attention. One witness might misremember events. Two witnesses might unintentionally influence each other. But independent statements pointing toward the same individual demanded careful investigation. Still, rumors are not evidence. Bettner knew he needed much more before accusing anyone of murder. Rather than immediately confronting Joseph Geiger, he chose a different strategy. He called him on the telephone. The conversation sounded casual. Bettner explained he was reviewing the old investigation and wanted to speak with people who had been around Schuylkill Haven during the summer of 1985. Geiger appeared relaxed. He said he barely knew David. He described him as simply another neighborhood kid. He agreed to meet with investigators. Nothing about the conversation seemed unusual. Then, only hours later, the phone rang again. This time, Geiger was the one calling. His demeanor had completely changed. The calm confidence from earlier had disappeared. Instead, he sounded emotional. At times, he struggled to organize his thoughts. He began talking about strange subjects investigators hadn't even mentioned. He referred to bones. He spoke about odors in the woods. He discussed memories that had apparently stayed with him for years. He wasn't confessing. But he also wasn't speaking like someone completely detached from the case. To Bettner, it was an important development. Experienced investigators understand that guilty knowledge sometimes reveals itself in unexpected ways. People under stress often volunteer information nobody asked for. The conversation raised more questions than it answered. A formal interview was arranged. On the agreed day, Joseph Geiger walked into the Pennsylvania State Police barracks. The interview would last for hours. And before it ended, the investigation that had remained frozen for more than 20 years was about to change forever. Joseph Geiger entered the interview room appearing calm, but Corporal Robert Bettner quickly noticed subtle changes in his behavior. He avoided prolonged eye contact. He shifted in his chair. At times he answered questions confidently, only to hesitate moments later when asked to explain the same events in greater detail. Experienced investigators know that interviews are rarely about catching someone in a single lie. They're about listening, watching, allowing a person to speak long enough for inconsistencies to emerge on their own. Bettner didn't rush. He let Geiger tell his story. The interview began with simple questions. Where had he been during the summer of 1985? Did he know David Reed? How often had he seen him around town? Geiger minimized their relationship. He claimed David was just another neighborhood kid. Someone he occasionally saw riding his bicycle. Nothing more. But as the hours passed, his account began to shift. Small details changed. Timelines no longer matched earlier statements. Facts that had seemed certain suddenly became vague. Bettner patiently compared Geiger's answers with witness statements collected over the previous several months. Every contradiction was carefully noted. Then the investigator slowly began introducing information Geiger didn't expect police to know. He mentioned witnesses who remembered Geiger making threatening remarks about David. He brought up the party where Geiger had reportedly repeated the words, "I didn't mean to hurt him." He referred to the statement Christopher Major had shared about the comment involving the Reed case. With each new piece of information, Geiger's confidence appeared to fade. The room grew noticeably quieter. For years, he had lived with the belief that whatever had happened in the summer of 1985 had been buried forever. Now, more than 2 decades later, investigators were placing old memories, forgotten conversations, and long-hidden rumors directly in front of him. Bettner continued applying steady pressure. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't making threats. He simply kept presenting facts, one after another. Eventually, Geiger's emotional state began to change. He became visibly upset. At times, he cried. His breathing became uneven. He spoke about carrying guilt for many years. He hinted that he had wanted to tell someone what had happened. Still, he stopped short of giving investigators a complete explanation. Bettner knew he was close. But close wasn't enough. A successful prosecution would require evidence, corroboration, and a statement that matched the known facts. The interview ended without a full confession. However, investigators believed they had reached a turning point. The next phase of the investigation focused on verifying everything witnesses had reported. Old locations were revisited. Maps from the original investigation were compared with new witness accounts. Individuals who had remained silent for decades were interviewed again. Some admitted they had been afraid to speak in the 1980s. Others confessed they never imagined the information they possessed might matter. As more people came forward, investigators began building a timeline that looked very different from the one assembled years earlier. Several witnesses independently described Geiger's unusual behavior after David disappeared. Some remembered him acting nervous. Others recalled conversations that made little sense at the time but became deeply troubling in hindsight. No single witness solved the case. Instead, each provided another small piece of a much larger puzzle. Bettner understood that cold cases are often solved this way. Not through one dramatic revelation, but through dozens of overlooked details that finally begin fitting together. Eventually, investigators concluded they had enough evidence to move forward. The information gathered during the renewed investigation pointed consistently toward one suspect. After more than 20 years, authorities believed they finally knew who was responsible for David Reed's death. Joseph Geiger was arrested and charged in connection with the case. For David's surviving family members, the arrest was an emotional moment unlike anything they had experienced in decades. They had waited years simply to hear someone acknowledge that David's death deserved answers. Now, for the first time, they believed justice might finally be possible. The case moved into the court system, where prosecutors presented evidence collected during both the original investigation and the renewed inquiry. Witnesses testified about statements Geiger had allegedly made over the years. Investigators explained how the cold case had been reopened and why attention eventually focused on him. The defense challenged portions of the evidence, arguing that memories from decades earlier could not always be considered reliable. It became one of the central issues during the proceedings. As with many cold cases, the prosecution faced significant obstacles. Time had claimed much of the physical evidence. Key witnesses had died. Memories had faded. Investigators were forced to rely heavily on testimony, corroborating statements, and the overall pattern that emerged from the investigation. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached its decision. Joseph Geiger was found guilty in connection with David Reed's death. More than 2 decades after a 13-year-old boy disappeared from the streets of Schuylkill Haven, someone was finally held legally responsible. Although the conviction brought a measure of justice, it could never erase the years the Reed family had spent wondering what happened. Joan Reed never lived to see the day an arrest was made. She died believing she might never know the truth about her youngest son. That reality remains one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case. For David's sister, Virginia, however, the outcome represented the fulfillment of a promise she had made years earlier. She refused to let her brother be forgotten. She refused to stop asking questions. Her determination helped keep the investigation alive until someone finally listened. The David Reed case demonstrates why cold cases matter. Time may destroy evidence. It may silence witnesses. It may cause entire communities to believe justice is no longer possible. But time can also loosen old loyalties. It can encourage guilty consciences to speak. It can inspire investigators to revisit evidence with fresh eyes. And sometimes, after decades of uncertainty, it can finally reveal the truth. David Reed left home on what should have been an ordinary summer afternoon. He told his mother he loved her. He climbed onto the bicycle he cherished. He expected to return home before the day was over. He never had that chance. His disappearance changed his family forever. His death haunted an entire town. And his case became a reminder that some mysteries refuse to stay buried. Even after decades of silence, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. If you're still watching, thank you for staying with us through this heartbreaking investigation. What do you believe was the most important turning point in this case? Was it the persistence of David's family, the witnesses who finally came forward, or the determination of investigators who refused to give up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective helps keep these conversations alive. If you found this documentary informative, please like this video, leave a comment, subscribe to Cold Case 247, and turn on notifications so you never miss another real cold case investigation. Every view, every comment, and every subscription helps ensure that victims like David Reed are never forgotten.